Okay, this one kind of scares me, but we're going to do a little bit of a different video. And it's a very deep video, a very complicated subject, but I'm still going to try to do it in one shot. So if I fuck something up or if something isn't quite as nuanced as I want it to be, it's because of the format of this and because to really, really do a deep dive into this, I feel like it could well be like flat out a college thesis paper. So I'm going to start this off. It's probably the title of this video, so it's a bit of a leading question, but would you recognize a dystopia if you were in one? And the reason that I ask this question is that personally I feel like so much of our images, so much of what we imagine a dystopia to be is informed by fiction. But the problem that I feel that I've been noticing more and more is that fiction, when it doesn't quite gel with reality, people either fail to notice the relativities or in some cases people just outright don't care. So let's, get into this and explore some different dystopias and why I feel like they don't work. Starting with what I will call kind of missing the point, which is cyberpunk. Because cyberpunk is intrinsically a dystopic setting. It's where the punk aspect of cyberpunk comes into it. I think it's important to remember because punk was originally a movement brought out that was very anti-capitalist, very anti-system. And that was its function. Its goal was very much fuck the system, we're fighting the system. And what has happened over time is that people have liked the aesthetic of punk, and they've sort of amalgamated the, borrowed it, taken it, and have left behind the message of punk. And what you see is something similar in a lot of cyberpunk fiction. So, for example, Blade Runner is sort of the premier cyberpunk work of fiction that most people have seen. This is a movie, not a book, because the book is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And one of the things that has been lost in the translation from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep to Blade Runner, the movie, is the class warfare that was kind of at the heart of that novel. Or not necessarily at the heart of it, because at the heart of it was still the humanity question, but it informed so much of that setting and is what sort of made it a good fit for cyberpunk, because it very much had that class conflict. Deckard, the whole concept of his electric sheep was that he couldn't afford a real animal because a real animal was simply too expensive. And this is a lifetime police officer, could not even afford a real animal. The entire planet is so fucked up that most people can't live there. The android, you have the sort of subhumans and the way that he's forced to live in I say subhuman, I don't remember the term for them, but basically the people who have been exposed to radiation, and it's caused their mental capacity to drop, and how they're basically treated like second-class citizens. He's forced to live in a derelict apartment building, and the androids eventually take advantage of him when they're trying to lay low. But basically, everywhere you look in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, what you see is class division. And that is at the core of cyberpunk. That it is meant to be a dystopia in which hypercapitalism has taken over, just run rampant unchecked, and what you have is this very stark divide between the haves, the quote-unquote corpo shills, and the have-nots. And again in Blade Runner, but when they transitioned that into the film Blade Runner, they really, really honed in on the humanist aspect. And that's fine, unto itself, the sort of existential question of what does it mean to be human and stuff like that. And in a movie, that's fine, because you're very limited in what you can do with a movie, because it's like 2 hours. So having that strong central theme and having everything built around that theme, good, great, don't have a problem with that. And to be honest, something I forgot to mention at the start of this, a lot of this isn't necessarily about the products themselves. A lot of it has to do with how people interpret the product. Or I should say the art or whatever. Because the sort of stumbling in Blade Runner, what it lost in not portraying that class divide, is that a lot of people watch Blade Runner and they see the big shiny advertisements and the big future city and the flying cars, and rather than see that as distractions from the fact that the quality of life is frankly fucking miserable, a lot of people are distracted by it successfully to the point where they actually want to live there. They want a future like Blade Runner because they like the aesthetic. And like, think about how bizarre that is. That the whole point is that this is a dystopia with flashing lights everywhere to distract people, and then people are so distracted, we as outsiders are watching this, and the flashing lights are distracting us so much that we start to think, yeah, that looks pretty good. And this is something I think Blade Runner 2049 addressed, did a better job of sort of bringing that element into play, albeit slightly muddled by the fact that Kay is a robot. It handled it better. I think Blade Runner 2049 handled a lot of things better, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, what has fundamentally happened with cyberpunk fiction is that much like punk itself, the aesthetic has been taken without the message. And it's not necessarily that I think that people can't enjoy the aesthetic. But the problem is, when you take the aesthetic from something, but not the message, but you still call it the same thing, then it ceases to be what it was. In other words, punk is no longer about rebellion, it's just another commodity. Rebellion itself is something to be packaged and sold. I mean, even bands, like, you see this in music a lot of your protest bands, Rage Against the Machine is like the biggest name I can think of, because on one level they are so much harder than a lot of poser bands that get up on stage and whine about some subject and then whine about how they didn't make enough money. The famous joke, what are we rising against this week? But, I sincerely believe that Rage Against the Machine believes in a lot of stuff that their music is, and they've done so many crazy stunts and shit that sincerely, to a certain degree, they accept that. But fundamentally, they are still selling a product for money. People are buying that, and the majority of that take is going to a corporation, because your rebellion is a product. And this has been sort of the cycle of capitalism. One of the sort of great powers of capitalism is to take anti-capitalist messages and repackage them and sell them to people in such a way that the thing that was originally a protest against capitalism becomes indicative of capitalism. And the fact that cyberpunk has completely lost, or makes only the most tertiary asides to that sort of class divide, the fact that so many people, when they think of cyberpunk, want to live in a cyberpunk world, to me is such a betrayal of that punk name, of where that came from. Because if you just care about the aesthetic of cyberpunk, that should be something different than what cyberpunk is. Because you can't have cyberpunk be fuck the system, while at the same time, wanting to live in that world. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So that's one way I feel it. But this is probably like the least offensive way. So the next sort of way that I want to get into, this one is really mostly the way people interpret dystopias, is The Handmaiden, and the way that when oppression in a book is tied to certain symbols, and we'll really get into this with 1984, I'm just kind of using The Handmaiden as another example. When oppression is tied to certain symbols and symbology in the dystopia, and that dystopia becomes so subsumed into the public consciousness that people start to look for these things that when they don't when things in real life happen that don't necessarily mesh with these things, people don't tend to notice it, don't tend to make associations with it, or in some cases they end up making the wrong associations. So specifically with The Handmaiden, or The Handmaid's Tale, the biggest problem that I see with it is that a lot of people who read it, namely women, namely the sort of feminist who believes in the patriarchy, not insofar as the idea that a lot of decisions are made for women on behalf of men in power, because traditionally men have been the ones in power, and therefore traditionally, not even traditionally, I mean to this day, it's the majority of the people making decisions are men. It's that the idea that the patriarchy includes all men, as though if you're a man, you are somehow inherently a part of this system whose fundamental purpose is to oppress women, and that if you're a woman, you are fundamentally a victim who views themselves as a victim. And sort of the problem with these kinds of oversimplifications of things, of these difficult issues, is that you lose a lot of nuance. And you lose these sort of markers that are meant to draw your attention, become things that you end up losing a lot of the depth in your sort of race for these markers. So I think a really, really good example is like the kicker for The Handmaid's Tale is that it all begins, that this oppressive government begins after a revolution. So it's kind of this great sudden change. And the problem is, in the United States, what has happened fundamentally with, like, let's do, reproductive rights is the big focus of the book. So let's talk about reproductive rights. Specifically, the repealing of Roe v. Wade in the current state of abortion and abortive care in the United States. There was not a revolution that caused this change. If you look at it historically, the abolition of Roe v. Wade has been a gradual push by pro-life groups working sort of tirelessly behind the scenes. They are a vocal minority, make no mistake about that. Like, poll after poll after poll shows that the majority of Americans support abortion, but this vocal minority, through legislators, through grassroots movements and whatnot, have managed to slowly erode the systems in place. And the biggest problem is, I say erode the systems in place, but this is another aspect of it where people got complacent. People saw Roe v. Wade and they thought, basically, we won. So nobody bothered trying to pass legislation on it, because they figured the precedent was already there. And in this sort of oversight, what ended up happening is, it turns out it was so much easier to undo. And by steadily gaining support, and not even gaining support, but through making subtle, quiet moves, they were able to stack a Supreme Court in such a way that they were able to overturn Roe v. Wade. It wasn't a big explosion. It wasn't a sudden overnight shift. It was something that was worked on for decades, behind the scenes, very quietly. And that's sort of my problem. That's one of my problems with this, is people expect dystopias to be kind of, or at least the way The Handmaid's Tale presents its dystopia is that there was this big cataclysmic event and then things became a dystopia. And that's not usually what happens. And again, this isn't like the Handmaid's Tale bad. It's more had to pause for a drink there. It's more the idea that people come to expect a certain thing from a dystopia based on certain markers that they found in books and other media. And then when what actually happens doesn't fit those markers, people are surprised or shocked because they weren't, looking at the right thing. And, going back to the whole angle of the patriarchy, another problem in that simplification is that all men are not part of one monolith, just as all women aren't part of one monolith, just as people of all race aren't one monolith, just like people of all, any kind of identity. It's not a monolithic thing. People are individuals. And that there are so many pro-life women out there who are responsible for this, and there are a ton of men who are pro-choice. So sort of dividing things out into this really simple patriarchy versus victimized women, it ends up drawing lines in the sand between friend and foe that isn't helping the issue on either side. It's really just dividing people who should be united. In a sense, making things worse because you're limiting your potential allies. So moving on from The Handmaiden, because really a lot of the stuff that I talked about in The Handmaiden is chump change compared to 1984. 1984, this book I think has done more damage in terms of how it has made people so laser focused on certain points that they end up missing the sort of big picture. And I can think of nothing else more poignant than the surveillance state of 1984 and the concept of Big Brother is always watching you. Because keep in mind that 1984 has essentially dominated the American mindset since its release. America still to this day lives in fear of capitalism. Cold War era Russia is ultimately the great invisible enemy that America is still determined to fight. And the problem with that is that in assuming it to be this Big Brother figure, again, people are fundamentally missing the ways in which privacy in this modern day and age is a complete disaster. And the bizarre thing is, it's not even secret. Most people are aware of it. It's just that as much as people get upset at the idea of the government spying on you, they are just as happy to sign away all of their privacy rights if it means that they can access social media. And that's sort of the big thing. Everything is collecting your data nowadays. If you go to, Meta, famously, the amount of data that they collected on their users, I mean, oh my god, there's so much that I don't even know where to begin. There's the stuff that you upload, that people upload to social media all the time, and then are shocked when it comes around to bite them in the ass. Like, people will argue that they have their privacy, and then willingly upload their most private and intimate details for anybody to see. But then you also have more subtle forms of information gathering. Basically, Google is constantly building a profile on you based off of your searches, based off of what you click on, based off of how long you look at a certain image. And every single website pretty much is collecting what articles you click on and what you look at, what ads you view, and then they're taking that data and they're selling it. So you are, as an individual, your habits are mapped down and recorded in just about every single thing that you do on the computer. And just about everybody knows it. And yet people continue to do it anyway, to the point where you are as tracked as a person as it is possible to be, short of having a camera on you at all times, which, to be honest, most people really do with their phones. And, the way that they engage with social media, that there's we live in that world. That world is now, in a way, almost more malicious than ever, because it's not even a government taking your information. It's just a corporation, it's just insane, that, and it drives me nuts that the sort of big counter to this is, not the big counter, but sort of the big saying is that we were so afraid of becoming 1984 that we became Brave New World. And, while that's true, again, it's just comparing one dystopia to another dystopia, which, comes with all the disasters associated with that. And mostly, what they're talking about with Huxley and Brave New World is the way that the masses are kept compliant through, the drug I don't remember if it was mana, if it was Vita, or it's something like that. Some well-known term for a sort of panacea life type thing. But again, there's so many other aspects to the dystopia in Brave New World, but most people aren't aware of that. Most people just know about the pill, the happiness, that aspect. And consequently, again, we're so afraid of oversimplification that we have looked to that we have become oversimplification is just a statement that is itself so grossly oversimplified that it creates, again, this false expectation that we are prepared for something because we know what to look for. And sort of, Which brings me to the last point, which is the most depressing one for me, is Squid Game. And I'm not going to talk about this one too much because there's been so many videos on this already, but all I really need to say is Squid Game, Mr. Beast. For the majority of you, that's enough. For those of you not in the know, I'll do a quick summary and then suggest that you find more detailed videos. But basically, the long and short of it is Squid Game is a Korean show. The idea is that a bunch of contestants are forced to play in these crazy games that, obviously have violent outcomes and whatnot because they're poor, underprivileged people, and then the rich people watch the game. And it's basically a giant metaphor for how, the wealthy are able to control the poor. And then Mr. Beast saw this, decided to make a real version for YouTube and content, and basically in 2 years, a show that was meant to portray a dystopia ended up becoming a real thing that surpassed the popularity of the show itself. And that's I somewhat buried the lead on this in the sense that the question is, would you recognize a dystopia if you lived in one? And whether or not this is a dystopia or not, I leave to you, because the exact definition is a bit muddy. But the fact of the matter is, you can portray a dystopia in fiction, and then a few years later, that real event can happen, and that real event is more popular than the satire. The satire becomes reality and is not rejected, but is in fact applauded and rewarded. At which point, I really have to ask, is dystopic fiction actually helping? And mind you, all of this comes from the perspective that dystopic fiction, the idea of the dystopia, is to help make people think about these things, about the worst case scenario of how things could go wrong. But if the problem is, people think that they're prepared because they've read these books, they've seen these movies, they know what a dystopia looks like, and then they see their real world and they see it doesn't quite line up to that one-to-one, so we must not be living in a dystopia. And that, I think, is sort of the tragedy. And some of it lies in the portrayal of the dystopias themselves, but some of it also lies in the interpretation. But at the end of the day, I don't even know if it's helping. I especially don't even know if it's helping when you can have somebody literally take the concept of a dystopia, make it a real show, and be wildly successful doing it. And at the start, I said that cyberpunk and people being attracted by the aesthetic of the cyberpunk but not the message is, probably the least offensive type thing. But I don't even know anymore, because again, it's robbing it of its meaning. It's not just robbing it of its meaning, it's then assigning a corporate meaning to something that was so anti-corporate that it's just disgusting in its own way. It's not only not what it originally was, but it actively becomes in contrast to what it originally was. And I just want to end on this note of, if you've noticed that lately words like unalive or some of the other terms, don't know, basically the YouTube safe words for topics like grape, yeah, essay, the YouTube top safe words for rape, sexual assault, suicide, and all those other nasty things, this has been slowly seeping into the modern vernacular that people use even outside of YouTube. So your language, our language, unfortunately, I have to include myself in this just because I speak in English, is being influenced not by people, but by a language, or but by corporations, because corporations don't want their brands associated with these words. So again, language is a huge thing. In dystopia, you have 1984 and doublespeak and whatnot, and people think that, okay, I know what that looks like, so I'm prepared to deal with it. But then they're using words like unalive and grape unironically because they think they know. But it turns out that reality is complicated. Dystopias are complicated. And the problem with dystopic fiction is that in the effort to portray a sort of worst case scenario where one side is already won, so much of the nuance ends up getting lost, or else in the case of something like Blade Runner, where the nuance becomes existential and the societal implications get lost, at which point, specifically with regards to, the original Harrison Ford Blade Runner movie, what was the point of it being cyberpunk in the first place other than to have robots? It could have just been science fiction. So that's why I'm not a huge fan. I genuinely am starting to come around to the thought that dystopias are actually more harmful to their own message, to their own purpose, to their own concept, than they are beneficial. And if you just enjoy, a good dystopian fiction because you think that the setting is cool, that's fine. I'm not trying to downplay that. It's why I haven't really mentioned something like The Hunger Games, because I didn't get the sense that the Hunger Games was trying to make an overly political message. But when you do get into things like it's not even Squid Game's fault, but like 1984, The Handmaid's Tale, Blade Runner, and some of these other ones that I've talked about, I think there really is a question that needs to be asked of, are we better off for having this fiction? Are we more prepared to face an actual dystopia? Or are we actually worse off for believing ourselves to be prepared? And that's where I'm going to end this.